This video will analyse the truth behind this meme. How accurate is it? To start with, Mozi on the left, a spring and autumn philosopher who lived just after Confucius, born in 470 BC in the state of Lu. Like Confucius, he is depicted as the beta on the left with the weak body language because he is a defensive siegecraft specialist. There are entire chapters in the Mozi dedicated to this. Mozi was fundamentally opposed to states taking over each other, particularly if one was a clear aggressor. Mozi then would oppose unification of states, which would bring about a mostly 400-year-long unbroken peace that we know as Pax Sinica under the Han Dynasty. Mozi would be in favour of city-states and smaller states all leaving each other alone. Looking back over the vast time span of Chinese history, let alone all of world history, one can generally notice the pattern that the state wishing to be left alone without growing or declining will tend to be taken over regardless of its wishes to be left alone. Thus, it seems a pointless value to strive for in politics. Mozi therefore only specialised in defensive siegecraft. Would Mozi then principally defend the Aztecs' mid-human sacrifice and say that they should continue their ways simply because they should be left alone? Such a thing seems to contradict his idea of Jian-ai, universal love, which we will cover in more detail later. Turning now to the Chad Confucius, bulging biceps and buttocks, lives rent-free in scholars' heads for 2,000 years. Indeed, Confucianism spread much later after Confucius' death, from 200 BC onwards, with several Confucians influencing the founder of the Han Dynasty, Liu Bang, in his governance style, essentially a combination of legalism and Confucianism. His progeny, Hammudi, instituted the first imperial entrance exams, and their content was focused on Confucian texts, cementing the link between the Chinese imperial dynasties and Confucianism for the next 2,000 years. For the last 2,500 years after Confucius' death, multiple disciples, both connected to him and self-proclaimed, took up Confucius's ideals for themselves, adding to his ideas, adapting and taking away. They called themselves Rujia, the school of Confucianism. People like Mencius, Mozi, Xunzi, and Zhuangzi, the Neo-Confucian, all considered themselves to be followers of the old sage. They had different perspectives, but all claimed to love Confucius. It was these people who would spread Confucianism to Japan, Korea and Southeast Asia in the following millennia. Writers and poets like Du Fu, the most significant poet in Chinese history from the Tang Dynasty over 1,000 years later, had to memorize his texts for the imperial entrance exam I mentioned earlier, and it is this which may have been an aggravating factor in the Taiping Rebellion in the mid-1800s. As mentioned here in the meme, Hong Shouquan was said to have been driven mad by Confucius. And in a way he was. Hong Shouquan was a scholar who'd spent his entire childhood and his family's fortunes invested on him and his studies in order to gain a place as a civil servant. Having failed 3 times, it was said that this experience, linked with some brief reading of hastily translated scraps of Christian theology coming via Hong Kong and the South, convinced him that he was the brother of Jesus, and the rest is Taiping Rebellion history. Confucius truly loomed large over the minds of Chinese scholars for thousands of years. On the other hand, the supposedly practical Mohism largely died out. Although there is much to be said for it, Mohism played little part in the ideas of great thinkers in Chinese history over the next millennia, and it is said of Mozi that music makes him seethe. Indeed, when it comes to Mozi, he was an advocate for Spartan living. He spent much of his time expounding on how awful music is in his work, the Mozi. Confucius, on the other hand, is a music appreciator. Confucius enjoyed music, and especially poetry. In the film Confucius, starring Chow Yun-fat as the grand old sage, he's even shown as being able to play a musical instrument rapidly and with enthusiasm. The entirety of human history shows that Confucius is correct here. What else are folk songs but ways of sharing an order? What else is a national anthem? Or even when moderns enjoy so-called pop music, Confucius certainly believed that music could contribute to moral order. Mozi, no affinity to any state or people, loves all. Indeed, Mozi really is an oddball who doesn't fit into any modern category. He's the most practical of all Chinese philosophers, even said to have been a carpenter, describing actual skills like defensive siegecraft in his book, and yet, at the same time, the most idealistic of all of them. when it comes to the concept of Gen-I, universal love. That is the ideal that one should extend universal love which one feels for oneself to all, regardless of who they are. Therefore, it does follow that Mozi would feel no affinity to any state. At best, one could say this is idealistic. At worst, one could say this is inherently disloyal and unattached. It is strange that modern so-called hippies tend to express similar sentiments. On the other hand, for the Chad, Confucius family comes first. One of the most repeated phrases throughout the Analects is the phrase shall, representing filial piety, and Confucius often goes into great detail about the proper decorum between relationships in the family. This is usually meant to be a pattern of deferral, parents to their parents, that is grandparents, children to their parents, younger siblings to older siblings, and subjects to the emperor. Confucius above all wanted harmony between these relations. Not just this, but also that these two should be two-way relationships respecting each other, in which the elder took care of the younger, and therefore, because of this fact, the younger respected the elder. Family does seem to come first to Confucius, and in his own life he certainly seemed to have a great affinity to the state of Lu in which he was born, and attempted to reform and save. According to Confucius too, horse people are barbarous. Yes, indeed, there are quotes throughout the Analects which distinguish between the peoples behind the walls and the nomadic horse peoples north of the Yellow River. Confucius singled them out, rightfully, as qualitatively different from the settled kingdoms behind the walls, as they were during the Warring States period, his era. He rightly regarded them as different. Time and time again through Chinese history, the horse peoples would play a part in the downfall of a dynasty, for example at the end of the Han and the Ming dynasties, and yet they were the symptom rather than the cause. On both occasions, the invading horse peoples only took advantage of internal civil war. In the case of the Ming dynasty, walking into a power vacuum in Beijing only after a civil war had torn it apart. Mozi is said to obsess over the habits of Confucius. Indeed, there are verses in the Mozi referencing the actions described in Book 10 of the Analects in Confucius. It is clear from this that if not Mozi, then at least his disciples were aware of the Analects, and therefore Mozi seems to spend much of his time reflecting on Confucius, and that links us to the next point. Confucius wouldn't have even known who Mozi was. Indeed, he died 9 years before Mozi was born. At the same time, they were men of the same warring state, the little state of Lu. As many warring states philosophers were, they were men of the Eastern literati states. Like Confucius, who also left his home state to find a willing patron to put into practice his ideals of governance, Mozi also left his home state to serve in the small state of Song. Therefore, whilst Confucius would have loomed large over the life of Mozi, a man of his home state after all, Confucius would never have even known Mozi. In some ways their lives were similar, however they took very different angles on what it was to be good. And of Confucius it says that he was a noticer before they were even a thing. Well, he did notice that in his home state of Lu, the people who actually held power were powerful families who hid behind the actual duke. Confucius desired to return authority to the Duke Ding of Liu. He observed and saw that these three families really held the power, and attempted to overthrow them. Confucius was the first noticer. All in all, I'd rate this meme as ascendant for accuracy. It is without doubt that we have to admit the legacy of Confucius is far more formidable, and that if people didn't live up to his morality and governance, that's not a fault of his. At the same time, I'll be amiss not to note the wisdom I have gleaned from reading the Mozi. There were times upon reading the Mozi, like this quote, where I sensed a man of intelligence and wisdom, thinking along the right lines, and unfortunately going off onto tangents in the weeds. A work worthy of more attention than it gets.